I want to take a minute here to kind of take a different look at this well-known book, 1984. I've read it. I read it once. I saw the film. Um, I think it was like the newer one from the 80s. I want to say it was maybe like, was it Robert Carlyle? Anyway, starring in it. So, it's something I've known of for a long time. Um, it's one of those things you should read, but then I think we should let go of it because I think it's one of those things people get fixated on it. So, for those of us who've grown up in Christian and Islamic cultures, we have a fixation and an addiction on looking for a Messiah around every corner. And so, to some, Orwell fits this Messiah status as he had these unique insights at the time in the late 1940s, or at least he wrote about them. He was part of a group of people who were thinking differently than everyone else. So he kind of has this Messiah status. And that's we've been, especially those of us growing up in Islamic and Christian cultures, we've been raised to basically devalue ourselves. Like we can't do anything for ourselves. We need a Messiah. Um, there's that whole part of it. Now, the other thing too is like Orwell in 1984. They're like the gold standard of the whole conspiracy and truther world. For many years now, because it's like, oh, this is the warning. This is what's gonna happen. Well, there's a lot of valuable insight in that book, I think, but it's like you have to read it, understand it, watch the film, and just let it go. I've known people over the years who like read it every year, like read it every couple years. And because we've grown up in a television society, it's even the people who are retiring and going to nursing homes now, and the old people now were the first generation raised by a television, and now we're into what, like the third, fourth generation have been raised by televisions. So we've come to see like basically sitting around and watching something, reading something, thinking about something, and just thinking about it and ruminating on it and getting together with friends and just bitching about it. We've come to see this as doing something productive because in this TV society, we're a bunch of voyeurs and we don't really do anything. Because again, we've been taught to devalue ourselves for centuries, primarily by Christianity, Islam. So we don't think we can do anything. So we just either alone on our own or get together with like-minded friends and we bitch about things and freak out about things. We acted like we did something. So 1984 has become a focal point for this, interestingly. And, when you take it even further back, we live a very easy lifestyle. We've grown up with very spoiled, easy lifestyles here in the Western world, all of us. And we haven't had anything decent. We haven't had anything to really be afraid of, except, not being considered successful by mommy, daddy, siblings, friends, neighbors. Not being considered stylish by all those people. Not being a great American dream success story. Those are like usually our worst fears. And that's a pretty recent thing. For most of human history, we've had actual things to cry about and be afraid of, you know. And if you go back to, you imagine ancient times, right, where, you know, people were, you know, in like a hunter-gatherer situation, maybe living in huts or caves, people could hear, you know, night predators. You're talking like wolves howling and bobcats and lynxes like screeching and screaming. If you never heard that, look that one up. That's like in person, that's a pretty like hair-raising sound. So people would hear these things in the night and their imaginations would run wild. And I think like this is where, you know, and this is not an original thought to me. I've been clued into this by the people, but this is where the whole concept of demons came from. People would hear natural phenomenon and their imaginations would run wild and they would create all these stories in these mental constructs around what they heard and what they were feeling. You know, emotions are physiological reactions to thoughts, right? So humans had real legitimate things to cry about and freak out about. Then we got into the whole American dream world, especially after World War II. Everything's pretty much done for us. And, you know, life's pretty easy. But it's like we want, you know, deep down, we want some kind of struggle. We want some kind of challenge. So we watch documentaries, we read books, and we freak out. And we act like we're getting something done. Well, we're not. And then, you know, that really leads to like the crux of why I made this video is like, okay, so you've got Orwell's 1984. A book's just a book. It's not good or evil, harmful or helpful. It's what you do with it, right? So, what do people do with it? It can be a bit of a crutch. It's like I said, I've known people over the years who like read it every year. And it's like, well, what's that doing for you? Or they talk about it constantly. It's like everything in the world they don't like. They're like, oh, it's just 1984. It's just like 1984. Orwell. And it's like Big Brother, party, Ministry of Truth. And it's like, okay. Yeah, well, he had a lot of insight and foresight and all that. So it was valuable. Now, the other thing, too, there's a little nuance about Orwell. It's like when you see any of his interviews, especially his last interview, he describes 1984 as a parody. So it wasn't a gospel. It wasn't something to like read over and over and fixate on and, you know, lose your fucking mind about. It was a parody. He was making fun of the establishment, you know, in Britain, in the Western world, and all over the world, because after World War II, these allies had supposedly defeated fascism, even though they gave the Nazis new homes in their own countries. But then they acted just like the Nazis, just like the Soviets. So he was making a parody because he was like, is it people in power are fucking power hungry hypocrites who act just like their enemy, but since they've won and they're writing history, they just demonize and accuse the other side of the same shit they do. And then the mass of people are just, you know, they're mentally feeble and they just want to please government, churches, schools, families. They just want to please authority figures. And they don't want to go through the trouble of being themselves and thinking for themselves and telling themselves what to do. You know, and that's an interesting thing too, is like these, I should make another video about this, but when you get into the roots of, you know, what is Luciferianism? What is Satanism? It's not about eating babies and all this shit. It's about going against convention. That's what those really are when you get into the meanings of the words and the history of the movements that grew up around it. It's about going against convention. So people don't want to be bothered to do that. They just want to please an authority figure. It's like what was that scientist's name? There was a scientist at Yale who, what was this, during the 70s, 60s or 70s? He did an experiment where he was convincing people that they had the power to flip a switch and electrocute someone in the other room. They weren't really electrocuting someone. They had hired actors, and the actors would scream like they were being electrocuted. And the scientist, it was Milgram. I think it was Stanley Milgram. Stanley, the Milgram experiment. So he told the subjects that, you know, you can electrocute someone up to this voltage without killing them. And he goes, but if you exceed this voltage, you won't have any legal liability because it's, because under the conditions of this study, you won't get in trouble. So people would flip this switch, and the actor in the next room would scream like they were being electrocuted. And it was a majority of people actually exceeded the lethal voltage, and the actor acted dead. And people did this just because they wanted to please figures of authority. So that is something in 1984 that Orwell is parodying. He's making fun of people in power, but he's making fun of the vast majority of just everyday citizens, right? So he wasn't writing it as a gospel to fixate on and memorize and read and reread and reread and reread. So, okay. Was his book 1984? Was Orwell's book 1984 a helpful warning? Or was it like subversive mind control programming? Well, it depends on how you relate to it. So if you read it, you watch the movie, take the lesson on board, okay, I'm done with it. And if things come up in the world, you might be like, oh, it's just like 1984. Okay. And if you read it when you were young, you reread it again, it's like, well, you get a fresh perspective. But it's like, I know I've known so many people where it's like everything going on in the world, it's always about 1984. When you fixate on it, when you treat it like a gospel, you basically subversively program yourself. And you program yourself to panic and to think you're getting something done by panicking, whether it's alone or with a group of friends. If you read 1984 excessively, you're always thinking about it and framing every situation within the context of 1984. What you're going to do is you're going to make it happen. You're going to bring that type of a world about. I mean, and the world was going in that direction, but when people panic about shit and they don't take any constructive action, you're playing right into the hands of the authoritarian, totalitarian psychopaths. You're doing exactly what they want you to do. You're chasing your tail instead of undermining them. And the best way to undermine them, empower yourself. Feel that you can actually do something for yourself and do it. And because when you fear somebody and you keep panicking about how much power they have and what they're going to do, you're worshiping them. And this is why in his book Wedding the Devil, Napoleon Hill said, the biggest devil worshippers out there are actually religious people, Christians, Muslims, etc. Because they devote so much time to freaking out about the devil and just thinking about him and blaming him for everything. And this is very empowering for people running churches. They've taught people just just blame Satan, just blame the devil. Don't like the world, just blame the devil. Don't like your life, just blame the devil. Don't actually do anything. If you did something, you wouldn't need your pastor. You wouldn't need your church pastor. You could do whatever the hell you wanted. Um, you can improve your own life. Or if you're not religious, you wouldn't need Dr. Tony the Rat Fauci or, the scientism establishment. It's not just religious people. It's atheists and secular people too. So yeah, little perspective on 1984 here. Don't get stuck in that shit. Have a good one.